It was one of those ideas that sounded better in the planning stages. My siblings and I had talked about doing a weekend camping trip for a while. Just the three of us, no parents, no kids, no stress. The weather looked decent when we checked, and we figured even if it rained a little, it would be part of the adventure. We picked a wooded campground next to a lake, about 40 minutes from my grandpa's house. It was isolated enough to feel like an escape, but not so remote that we couldn't bail out if something went wrong. We got there mid-afternoon. It was quiet. A few other campers scattered in the area, but far enough that we felt like we had our own space. We picked a spot just off the tree line, close enough to the lake that we could see the water through the branches. It was calm, peaceful even. We spent an hour setting up the tent, making sure the rainfly was tight, staking down the corners, and smoothing out the floor inside with sleeping pads and bags. We built a fire pit with some found rocks and gathered wood, getting a small blaze going just before the sun started to drop. Dinner was basic: canned beans, hot dogs, chips. We didn't need anything fancy. We ate while the sun slipped behind the trees and the lake started turning into a dark mirror. The air cooled off fast, and by the time the fire was really going, we were all sitting close to it. We spent most of the night telling old stories and roasting marshmallows. Nothing dramatic. No scary stories. No wild animal sightings. Just a quiet evening in the woods. Around 10 p.m., the wind started picking up. Nothing major at first, just a steady breeze that kicked leaves up into the firelight and made the trees creak a little. We didn't think much of it. Weather changes fast in the woods. We doused the fire, crawled into the tent, zipped it up, and got settled in for the night. I woke up maybe an hour later. The wind had gone from a steady breeze to something stronger, louder. It pressed against the sides of the tent like a giant hand, making the fabric pop and pull against the stakes. I could hear the lake too. It wasn't the gentle lap of water anymore. It was thrashing, hitting the shore hard, like waves trying to get farther inland. I laid still for a while, listening. Then came the lightning. I've been through storms before, some pretty bad ones, but this was something else. It wasn't a flash here or there. It was a constant, blinding light that lit up the entire forest like a strobe light, except it wasn't blinking, it was crawling. The sky didn't go dark in between strikes. It was lit up solid, lightning moving across the sky like roots or cracks in ice. And the thunder was just as bad. It didn't roll in waves like normal. It was one long, continuous roar, like a train screaming over our heads without end. The wind kept getting worse. Our tent, which we thought we'd anchored well, was buckling at the sides. The poles bent inward. I saw the roof of the tent lift a few inches, then slam back down. I felt the floor lift slightly under my sleeping pad. My siblings were both awake by then, moving around in the dark, trying to hold things down with their bodies. The tent felt like it might come apart completely. That's when we all made the same call. The car. We burst out of the tent and ran. Felt like running underwater. The wind pushed against us, almost knocked us sideways. Branches whipped past us, the rain cutting across our skin like needles. The car was maybe 40 feet away, parked just off the main gravel trail, and getting to it felt like fighting through a wall. When we got inside, slammed the doors, it felt like we'd climbed into a bunker. But the storm didn't let up. The car shook hard enough that it felt like someone was outside rocking it back and forth. Trees bent and swayed around us, and in the flashes of light I could see debris flying through the air. Leaves, branches, pieces of someone's tarp, or maybe even another tent. I looked back toward our campsite just in time to see our tent collapse entirely. The poles snapped, the fabric twisted up and took off into the trees like a sail. We sat in the car for another 10 minutes before making the second decision to leave the campground completely. We didn't even talk about it, we all just knew. I started the car, headlights bouncing across the flooded trail as we pulled away. Branches scraped the sides, and leaves flew across the windshield like a swarm of insects. Driving out wasn't easy. The trail was half mud, half gravel, and the wind made it hard to keep the car steady. A couple of trees had fallen halfway across the road, but we were able to squeeze by. It took about 20 minutes to reach my grandpa's place. We parked in his gravel driveway and ran through the rain to the porch, soaking wet but too tired to care. Inside, it was warm and quiet. We crashed on couches and spare beds, grateful for walls that didn't move and a roof that didn't sound like it was going to rip off. The next morning, the storm had moved on. It was cooler, damp, the sky still gray but no longer angry. We ate a quiet breakfast and then made the drive back to the campground. The roads were a mess. Some were blocked completely by trees. Others had utility trucks already working on clearing things out. When we finally got to the site, it looked like a war zone. Trees were down everywhere, splintered in half or completely uprooted. Limbs lay across picnic tables. Parts of the gravel trail were flooded or caked in mud. Our tent was gone. The only thing left was one bent metal pole stuck in the ground. We found parts of it a little way off, caught in the low branches of a tree, shredded and useless. Sleeping pads, cooking gear, water jugs, most of it was scattered across the site or gone completely. My sleeping bag was just missing, like it had vanished entirely. We later learned that a small tornado had gone through the area sometime during the night. Whether it happened while we were in the car or after we left, we didn't know. The campground had been partially closed off because some of the roads were still blocked by fallen trees. From what we could tell, the path of destruction was close. Too close. We cleaned up what we could, gathered what was still usable, and left. Nobody said much on the way home. I think we were all still trying to process it. It was the most violent storm I'd ever experienced, and I'd never felt so small in the face of nature. We didn't camp again for a long time after that. And even now, years later, I still think about that night. The way the lightning lit up the sky nonstop. The sound of the wind as it tried to rip our tent off the ground. The feeling of the car shaking like it might roll over. And the strange emptiness when we returned and found our things scattered or gone. I never did find that sleeping bag. I'm not even sure where it could have ended up. Maybe it got pulled up into the sky. Maybe it's still tangled in the trees somewhere. Or maybe it just vanished into the storm, carried off like the rest of our peace of mind. All I know is that nature doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't care how well you stake down your tent or how many times you check the forecast. When it decides to show its power, you get out of the way. And if you're lucky, you live to clean up the mess. It was a story I'd heard from my parents growing up, told in pieces over the years, never quite as a full account. I only started to understand how wild it actually was once I was old enough to go camping myself and grasp how deep into nowhere they really were. They'd gone on a canoe trip in Saskatchewan, somewhere far off the grid, deep into the backcountry, where there were no roads, no cabins, no trails, and no way to call for help. Just endless lakes, spruce forests, wet underbrush, and raw wilderness. They were used to roughing it, and they loved it. It was one of those trips where you plan to be gone for a week or two, paddling and portaging from lake to lake, carrying your gear over beaver dam trails and sleeping in a different spot every night. They had plotted out a loop through the boreal forest that covered a large area. They packed light but carefully: tent, sleeping bags, tarps, a small camp stove, food in bear-proof containers, a compass, maps, and all the usual gear. No cell service out there, no GPS, just paper and experience. My dad had grown up in the bush, and my mom wasn't new to it either. It was midsummer. The weather had been warm and mostly dry during their trip so far. The bugs were bad, especially in the evenings, but that was to be expected. They'd been paddling for days, making their way across lakes so still and quiet it felt like they were floating through some dream version of reality. Long stretches of water that seemed to go on forever, ringed by thick, dark green forest. Every now and then, they'd see signs of life. A moose in the distance, loons calling out across the water, fish breaking the surface. But no people, not a single one. They'd set up camp on a narrow strip of land between two lakes that night. One of those peninsulas that sticks out just far enough to catch some breeze and keep the mosquitoes somewhat at bay. They pulled up their canoe, unloaded their gear, and made a small clearing just up from the shoreline. The forest was dense, the ground soft with moss and pine needles, and the silence out there had a weight to it, a kind of hush that makes you feel like you're the only ones left in the world. They ate dinner just as the sun was setting, simple stuff, dried pasta and beans, boiled over the stove. Afterward, They hung their food in a bag from a tree a good distance away from their tent and turned in early. It had been a long day of paddling, and they were worn out. The tent was pitched on a flat patch of earth, the fly staked down tight, their gear stacked inside to keep it dry. My dad always double-checked the perimeter before going to sleep. No food left out, no smells that could attract anything. He'd done this dozens of times. They zipped the tent shut and lay down, listening to the last sounds of the forest before sleep took over. The distant call of a loon, the whisper of wind through the spruce. Sometime in the early morning, the calm broke. At first, it was just a faint noise, a soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush nearby. My dad stirred but didn't open his eyes. Animals passed near camp sometimes. Raccoons, deer, even the occasional fox. He thought maybe a squirrel or something small was poking around. The sound kept on, growing louder, like something heavier than a squirrel, something brushing against low branches and stepping over roots. Still half asleep, he propped himself up on one elbow. The noise was close now, real close, right behind the tent. He tried to shake off the fog of sleep, brain still catching up. It sounded like whatever it wasn't just walking. It was moving clumsily, snapping twigs, rustling bushes, something big. Then his whole side of the tent just collapsed in. The wall hit him fast, like a sack of wet sand dumped over his chest and face. It knocked the breath out of him. His first thought wasn't even fear, it was confusion. He thought maybe a tree branch had fallen, maybe something shifted, but no crack or crash had come before it. Just weight, heavy, sudden weight. The pressure lasted only a second or two. Then it lifted. He gasped, shoving the fabric off himself, now wide awake, adrenaline flooding his chest. My mom was already up, scrambling to unzip the flap. They spilled out of the tent together into the damp morning air, blinking at the sudden light. Dew clung to the grass and the edge of the forest steamed in the early sun. About 10 feet away stood a black bear. It wasn't charging or growling. It looked just as startled as they were. Its head was tilted, its snout twitching. Its ears flicked forward, then back. My parents froze for a moment. The bear stood still. The air was thick with tension, but the bear didn't move. It looked confused, almost embarrassed, like it wasn't quite sure how it had ended up there. It sniffed the air one last time, huffed, turned, and lumbered off into the bush. Everything was still again, but it took a long time for the fear to settle. They stood there for minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Looking at the tent, the collapsed wall, the prints in the dirt just behind where they had slept. The bear must have been walking along the edge of the brush, maybe foraging or sniffing around, and lost its balance. There was a small slope behind the tent, and the undergrowth was thick. It must have stepped wrong, slipped, and fallen straight onto the tent. They didn't sleep the rest of that morning. They fixed the tent and packed up camp early. They skipped breakfast, their nerves still frayed. Even though the bear had run off, they didn't want to hang around and risk another encounter. Once everything was loaded up, they pushed the canoe into the water and paddled out, glancing back at the shore that had been so peaceful just hours before. They paddled for hours that day, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the bear encounter. Their hearts didn't really slow down until late afternoon when they found a new place to camp, a rocky outcrop at the edge of a wide lake. No brush close to the tent this time. They kept their gear even tighter that night, hung the food even higher, checked the perimeter twice. Nothing else happened for the rest of the trip, but that moment stuck with them. The way the weight had crushed the tent, the bear's eyes when it stared at them, the way it had looked more scared than angry. It hadn't meant to attack. It had just been surprised. But that didn't make it any less real. Years later, my dad would still bring it up, usually as a joke. He'd say he was one of the few people in the world who could honestly say he got sat on by a bear. But the truth was, it had shaken him. It reminded them both how thin the wall is between being comfortable in nature and being at its mercy. Out there, you're not in control, not really. You're just part of the landscape, and anything can happen. The story never needed embellishment. It didn't have ghosts or mystery sounds or anything supernatural. It was just raw, real wilderness. And a bear? clumsy and curious, accidentally landing on someone's tent in the middle of nowhere. That was enough. They didn't stop camping after that, but they were more careful about where they pitched their tent. They avoided brushy edges, made sure the ground was flat and open, and always scanned for tracks. My dad used to joke that if a bear was going to fall on him once, it probably wouldn't happen again. Still, he always slept a little lighter after that. Sometimes when I'm out there myself, deep in the woods, far from anything, I think about that morning. The way things can change in a second. One wrong step, one moment of imbalance, and I remember how real the wild is, how alive it is, how close it can get. And every now and then, I find myself looking over my shoulder, checking the brush behind the tent one more time before zipping it shut for the night. It was early July when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the northern woods. I had the time off work, the forecast looked decent, and I just needed a break from everything. I wasn't looking for anything intense, just a few days of quiet, no phone, no people, just me, the lake, and the trees. I picked a place I'd found on a backcountry forum, a remote camping spot only accessible by canoe. It was supposed to be peaceful, beautiful, and most of all, isolated. I drove for hours on winding roads through endless stretches of pine and spruce before finally reaching the edge of the lake. The sky was a pale blue with big, slow-moving clouds, and the sun was warm without being overbearing. I parked my truck by a small launch spot, loaded up the canoe with my pack, tent, and a few essentials, and pushed off. The lake was glassy and calm, the kind of stillness that amplifies every little splash and bird call. The paddle took a little over an hour. The site I had in mind was on a little peninsula that jutted out from the mainland, surrounded by water on three sides. It had a rocky shore, a flat spot for a tent, and some decent tree cover. I pulled the canoe up, unpacked my gear, and started setting up. I took my time, collected some firewood, rigged a tarp over my tent for extra weather protection, set up a small cooking area near the fire pit, and even brought a book to relax with. That first evening was just about perfect. I cooked some dehydrated food over my little stove, watched the sunset paint the lake orange and gold, and stayed up listening to the loons calling back and forth across the water. The stars came out thick, like someone had dumped salt across a black tablecloth. I crawled into my sleeping bag feeling full, calm, and more relaxed than I'd been in months. The second day was uneventful in the best way. I paddled out to a few nearby islands, did some fishing with little success, and spent most of the day just taking it easy. I kept my food hung high between two trees, my trash bag sealed and hung too, and made sure to clean up thoroughly after meals. I knew bears were a possibility, but I'd camped alone before and never had an issue. Plus, it was early enough in the season that I figured I might not see much wildlife beyond the odd deer or squirrel. That night, I was dozing off to sleep when I heard something in the bushes behind the tent. It was a steady rustling, not frantic, not loud, but definitely close. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or a porcupine. I sat up a bit, listening, trying to place the sound. It moved slowly, shuffling and sniffing. My heart rate picked up. I didn't have a weapon, just some bear spray and a hatchet by the zipper flap of the tent. I stayed still and waited. Then, without warning, the whole left side of the tent collapsed inward on top of me. It wasn't a full cave-in. More like something heavy had pressed against it and then backed off, but it was enough to pin my shoulder and part of my chest for a moment before letting up. I flailed instinctively, trying to push it off, thinking the pole had snapped or something worse. The pressure lifted almost immediately. I scrambled upright inside the tent, my hands shaking, breathing hard. Outside, I could hear quick shuffling and the sound of something brushing against the bushes. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. About 10 feet away stood a black bear, mid-sized, maybe 200 pounds, looking as startled as I felt. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't pawing the ground or showing its teeth. It just stood there, blinking, like it was trying to figure out what had just happened. For a long moment, we both just stared. The bear's head was tilted slightly, its nose twitching. It looked like a cartoon character who had accidentally knocked over a lamp and wasn't sure if it should apologize or sneak away. Its ears were up, its whole body alert but not hostile. It was just confused, like it had stumbled into something unexpected and was now trying to figure out its next move. The bear shifted its weight, turned slowly, and without any real panic, trotted back into the woods.
No dramatic dash.
No angry huff, just a quiet exit like it had wandered into the wrong room and realized it was time to leave. I sat there in the doorway of the tent for a long time. I wasn't afraid in the screaming, heart-pounding way people describe when they're in danger. It was more like a deep, rooted unease. I got out, flashlight in hand, checked around the site. No torn bags, no missing food. My bear hang was untouched. Just a dent in the side of my tent where the pole had bent a little. I didn't go back to sleep. I stayed up with my headlamp on, sitting in the camp chair, listening to the woods. Morning came slow and gray. A light mist hung over the lake, and everything felt damp and still. I made coffee and oatmeal and tried to settle back into the peaceful rhythm, but it wasn't the same. Every sound in the trees made me tense. I kept thinking about the way the tent had collapsed, the way the bear had looked at me, like it hadn't meant to cause trouble, like it had just made a mistake. I packed up slowly, not because I was rushing to leave, but because I wanted to do it right. Double-check everything, make sure the fire pit was cold, the trash packed out, the canoe balanced. I took one last look at the site before pushing off. The place was still beautiful, still quiet, still worth coming to, but I knew I wouldn't forget that night. Paddling back across the lake, I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see the bear watching from the shadows. I didn't, of course. It was gone, probably back to sniffing around for berries or grubs. It wasn't an evil creature or a monster, just a big animal with poor footing. When I got back to the truck, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, tension, gratitude. I loaded up, took one last deep breath of the pine-heavy air, and started the long drive home. In the weeks after, I told a few close friends about the trip. I didn't make it into some big dramatic story. I just said a bear fell on my tent, and we had a moment. It wasn't angry. It wasn't scary in the usual sense, but it stayed with me. That experience changed the way I see the woods. Not in a bad way, but in a way that reminded me that I'm the guest out there. Nature doesn't care about your plans or your peace and quiet. It just is. And sometimes that means getting sat on by a bear who didn't mean any harm. Looking back, it's almost funny. I can still picture that bear's face. Wide-eyed, ears perked, looking at me like, oh no, did I just ruin something? My bad. And then walking off like it had somewhere else to be. That's the story I tell now when people ask if I've ever had a scary experience camping. It's not the scariest one out there, but it's the one I remember best. Because it was real. Because it reminded me how small I am out there. And because, honestly, how many people can say they've been gently sat on by a confused bear? I still go camping. I still sleep in tents. But now I tie my bear hang a little higher, check the bushes twice, and never forget that somewhere out there is a bear with a story too. About a night it tripped over a nylon bubble and scared some weird human half to death. I'll start by saying I've always enjoyed being outdoors, but I wouldn't call myself some rugged survivalist or anything like that. I grew up hiking in Michigan, mostly day hikes, some overnighters when I had the gear for it, but nothing extreme. When my girlfriend and I started dating, we found out we both had this mutual love for hiking and camping, and after a while, it just became something we did pretty regularly. It wasn't about adventure or adrenaline. It was just peaceful. That's what I liked about it. The quiet, the simplicity, just you and the woods and the trail. It was sometime in late spring, maybe early May. The temperatures had started getting comfortable again, and most of the snowmelt was done. It had been wet a couple weeks before, but we'd had a good stretch of dry days, so the trails were solid and dry. We picked a stretch of the North Country Trail that neither of us had done before. It was one of the more wooded sections, winding through dense hardwood forest and climbing gradually through a few small ridges. Nothing too crazy, just a peaceful overnight hike to kick off the season. We started mid-morning, parked at a trailhead off one of the access roads, and made our way in with the plan to hike maybe 8 to 10 miles the first day. We weren't rushing. It was warm but not hot, maybe mid-60s. The air smelled clean. pine and damp leaves and that sweet earthy smell you only get in the woods in spring. The trail was well marked. You could hear birds most of the time, some woodpeckers in the distance. Squirrels darted around, rustling the brush. The terrain wasn't too challenging, but it kept things interesting. Some narrow switchbacks, some low, marshy spots with footbridges, a few stretches where the canopy opened up and sunlight poured through. We talked a little, but mostly we just walked and took it all in. By early afternoon, we had made good progress. We had maybe another mile or two before our goal, which was just a small marked backcountry camping area with a fire ring and a couple of flat clearings. It wasn't official like a campground, just a place people used and kept clean. Our plan was to hang our hammocks, cook dinner, and sleep light before heading back the next day. But about 2/3 of the way there, we saw a nice little spot tucked maybe 30 feet off the trail. A cluster of trees close enough for hammocks, mostly flat ground, and just enough cover to feel out of sight. It wasn't an official site, but it looked used before. No trash or signs of fires, just natural clearing. Felt right. We figured we'd rest there for a bit before pushing on, maybe even just stay if we felt good about it. We set up our hammocks pretty quick. We'd gotten decent at it by now, webbing straps around trees, making sure they weren't dead, giving a few good tugs before committing. Once everything was up, we just laid there, swaying gently in the shade. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in once you stop walking. No cars, no background hum of anything, just occasional chirps from birds, wind through the trees, and the light creak of the hammock straps. I must have dozed off a little. Not deep sleep, just that warm, still kind of tired kind of rest where your body relaxes but your ears still pick up everything. At some point, I heard a rustle. Not a branch snapping, not leaves falling, but that slow, deliberate crunch of something stepping through dry underbrush. It was close, like 10 feet away, maybe less. I opened my eyes and slowly sat up just enough to look over the edge of the hammock. There was a coyote standing just inside the brush line. Thin, grayish-brown fur, ribs slightly visible, tail low. We made eye contact for a second, one of those locked stares where you could feel both sides waiting to see what the other would do. Then it turned sharply and darted away, disappearing into the trees with barely any noise. But before I could even think much about that, I heard another sound on the opposite side of us. Bigger, heavier, like a branch cracking, followed by a sudden burst of movement, like something bolted away fast. I didn't see what it was. I only caught the noise and the blur through the trees, but it was definitely larger than the coyote. Could have been a deer, maybe, or something else. Whatever it was, it had been even closer than the coyote. That shook me a little. There's something about being between two wild animals that don't know you're there until they're practically on top of you. We hadn't been loud. We were 30 feet off the trail, quiet, still, not cooking food or making noise. For all I knew, the coyote hadn't been watching us at all. Maybe it was tracking something else. But either way, being that close to two different wild animals in under a minute didn't sit right. I unhooked from the hammock and started packing up. My girlfriend was already doing the same. No words, just a shared sense that we should keep moving. We packed quickly, quietly, double-checked for trash, and got back on the trail. The sun was still a couple hours from setting, but the light was starting to soften. Shadows stretched longer across the trail, and everything had that golden tone to it. We walked a little faster than before, not a panic pace, but steady. The trees felt thicker somehow, like they'd closed in behind us. The breeze had died down too. It was warm, still quiet again. About 5 minutes later, maybe less, we rounded a bend and came face to face with a black bear cub. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet ahead, just off the trail, standing beside a fallen log. It must have heard us at the same time we saw it, because it froze. It was smaller than I expected, with that soft, dark fur and clumsy little paws. But all I could think in that moment was, where is the mother? The cub made this quick huffing sound and bolted up the ridge away from us, crashing through the underbrush like a bowling ball. I never saw the mother, and we didn't wait around. We just kept walking. We didn't run, but we didn't stop either. I kept checking behind us every few seconds, half expecting to see a full-size bear sprinting after us. Nothing came. After that, everything felt different. We were still on the trail, still surrounded by the same trees and birds and air, but it didn't feel calm anymore. My ears were dialed in to every noise, every twig snap or flutter of leaves. Every squirrel sounded like something bigger. We didn't talk. We just walked, minds racing, hearts high in our chests. We finally reached the planned campsite maybe 30 minutes later. It was quiet, untouched, fire ring intact, trees spaced perfectly for hammocks. A small stream ran nearby, slow and clean. Under different circumstances, it would have felt perfect. But I didn't want to stay there anymore. Not that night. We didn't say it, but we both just started repacking again after a short break. There was still daylight left. We could push further, maybe even head all the way back out. We didn't eat much, just energy bars and water. Neither of us had an appetite. We hiked another hour, maybe more, before stopping for real. We ended up camping closer to the car than we planned, in a less scenic spot, near a gravel turnout. It was flat and boring, but it felt safe. We strung the hammocks again, this time between younger trees, farther from the woods and with a clearer view of everything around us. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept one ear open the whole time, even though nothing ever came. I heard an owl once, some distant coyotes later on, but nothing near us. No heavy steps, no surprise visitors, just the woods doing what they do. In the morning, everything looked different again. Bright, peaceful. That feeling of pressure was gone, like whatever weird tension had been hanging in the trees the night before had burned off with the dew. We made a small breakfast, instant oats and coffee, and packed up without much to say. The hike back to the car was quiet. It felt like we had walked out of something without even realizing we were walking into it. No big incident, no confrontation, just a series of things that lined up close together, too close. The coyote, the unseen animal, the bear cub, each one manageable on its own. But stacked like that, one after the other, it felt like we had threaded a needle without knowing it. Back at the car, I remember brushing the dirt off my boots and just standing there for a minute, feeling the weight of it all settle in. The stillness, the luck, the fact that nothing actually happened, but so much almost did. We've gone camping since then, even back on the North Country Trail, but we don't hang hammocks that close to the trail anymore. We don't stop unless we're sure. We don't assume quiet means alone. It's not fear, just awareness, a new kind of respect. And I still think about that moment in the hammock sometimes. Looking up, seeing the coyote, hearing something heavier behind me, how easy it is to miss the signs, how close you can come without even knowing it. Because the woods don't warn you, they just are. I had been camping solo for years. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I just liked the solitude. The woods had a way of draining the noise out of life. I worked a job that ran hot most of the year, and when I could escape, I did. Usually mid-fall, when the air was crisp but not brutal. That year, I went a bit earlier, late September. The leaves hadn't fully changed, but the nights had already started to bite. I packed my gear the same way I always did. No need for GPS or trail guides. I'd been to this particular spot a dozen times. It was about 6 miles from the trailhead, tucked deep in a small clearing that sat between a slow-moving creek and the rise of a low ridge. I parked my truck at the edge of the trailhead lot just before noon. There was only one other vehicle there, a dark green Subaru with Colorado plates, but I didn't think anything of it. The trail wasn't famous or even marked officially, mostly used by locals or experienced hikers. I didn't expect to run into anyone. I liked it that way. I didn't want people around when I camped. I moved faster on my own anyway. The hike in was uneventful, just how I liked it. I kept a steady pace and didn't stop often. It took me about 2.5 hours to get to the clearing. The ground was damp in spots, but nothing that would mess with the tent setup. I got my small camp in order by 4. Tent pitched, gear inside, fire pit cleared and ringed with stones, kindling stacked. I didn't plan on lighting the fire until dusk. That first night passed like so many others had. I cooked a simple meal, canned chili and a hard roll. I listened to the woods. The wind moved through the trees and rattled branches, but nothing unusual. I fell asleep by 9. Woke up once when something rustled outside the tent, but it didn't spook me. Animals passed through all the time, probably a raccoon or maybe a deer. I went right back to sleep. The second day I spent walking the perimeter, checking out spots where I used to fish along the creek. Water was low, not great for fishing. I made note of it and went back to camp. Read for a while, scribbled some notes in a small pad I carried, sharpened my knife just to pass the time. It was quiet, really quiet. No planes overhead, no distant voices, just the woods and me. That night I stayed up later. I kept the fire going past midnight, just sitting by it, staring into the flames. Something about the quiet felt heavier than usual. Not in a paranoid way, just dense. Like everything around me was watching but not hostile. Just attentive. When I finally crawled into my tent and zipped it up, I noticed how loud the zipper sounded. I didn't sleep as soundly, and I woke up 3 or 4 times. Not because of noises, just this sense that I wasn't alone out there. The third day started with me shaking that feeling off. I made some instant coffee, paced around the camp, and tried to act like everything was normal. I even laughed at myself, got dressed, shouldered my day pack, and decided to hike up the ridge behind the camp. I'd done it before. It wasn't high, maybe a few hundred feet of elevation, but it offered a decent view. About halfway up, I found something odd. A torn strip of fabric snagged on a low branch. It was dark green, faded, with a rough texture like canvas. Didn't match anything I wore or carried. I figured maybe it came from that Subaru hiker. They could have passed through here. I kept climbing, but I kept thinking about that strip. When I got to the top, I stood there for a while, staring out at the tree line and the slow flow of the creek below. Then I heard something, dull, faint, like metal clinking. I stopped breathing and listened harder. Came again, softer. I scanned the woods below but didn't see anything. It stopped after a moment. I didn't go back down the same way. I looped wide, keeping a cautious eye on my surroundings. I didn't see anyone or anything. I made it back to camp just before dark. My tent was undisturbed, gear still where I left it, firewood untouched, but something still felt off, like something had passed through while I was gone and managed to clean up after itself. I checked my food stash. Nothing was missing, but the placement of my pack looked slightly off. Not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. I had a habit of laying it on its side, with the straps facing left. It was facing right now. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the tent and listened. No bugs, no wind, no night calls from owls or coyotes. Just silence. I lay down fully clothed, boots on, knife tucked under my sleeping bag. I must have dozed off around midnight. I woke up sometime later to the distinct sound of footsteps. Not shuffling, intentional steps, soft but firm. Someone was walking near the edge of my clearing. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I waited. The steps circled once, then stopped, then nothing. I waited for what felt like hours, straining my ears. My heart was pounding. Finally, I slid out of the bag and inched toward the flap. I didn't unzip it. I just listened. Still nothing. No wind, no bugs, just dead silence. I don't know when I fell asleep again, but I did. When I woke up, it was fully light. I stepped out and immediately saw tracks. Not boot prints, bare feet, human, large, white, at least size 12 or 13. They circled the tent, then disappeared into the woods toward the creek. I packed up fast, faster than I ever had. Took down the tent, shoved gear into my pack without care, stuffed the leftover food into a trash bag, tied it off and hiked out without stopping. The trail felt longer on the way out. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every creak of the trees sounded like a person stepping on dead leaves. I didn't relax until I saw the trailhead, but the green Subaru was still there. That sent a jolt through me. That meant whoever owned it hadn't left. I stood by my truck for a minute, debating, should I report it? But report what? Bare footprints? A strip of cloth? A hunch? I didn't know. I got in and drove straight home. I didn't even stop for gas until I was out of the county. A few days later, curiosity got the best of me. I called the local ranger station, gave them the make and plate number of the Subaru, and said I was worried about someone who might have gone missing. The ranger on the line sounded tired. He said the car had already been reported. Belonged to a man in his 30s from Fort Collins. No one had seen him since the week before I went camping. Search crews had gone through the area but found nothing. No sign of him, no gear, no campsite, just the car. I never told them about the footprints. I never went back to that spot. And now, years later, I still think about that third night. How quiet it was. How careful the steps sounded. How someone or something stood outside my tent without saying a word. If I hadn't woken up, I wonder what might have happened. I wonder if the guy who owned that Subaru had woken up too, or if he hadn't. I had been wanting to backpack through the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho for years before I finally committed to the trip. There was something about that stretch of jagged peaks, high alpine lakes, and narrow valleys that had always called to me. I wasn't chasing some Instagram post or trying to tick it off a list. I just liked the idea of being out there, in a place that felt wild and untouched. When the time finally came, I planned carefully, pulled out maps, marked distances, factored in elevation gain, water sources, campsites. I wasn't new to backpacking. I knew what I was doing. I still do. The group I went with was small. Just 3 of us, including me. All of us were experienced, capable, not the kind to do anything reckless. We drove up from Boise and parked at the trailhead early in the morning, just after sunup. The air had that cold bite to it that you only get in the mountains, even in the summer. I remember pulling on my pack and feeling the weight settle in just right. It's a good feeling, like everything you need is strapped to your back and you can go wherever you want. We followed the trail for most of the day, climbing steadily, passing crystal clear streams and groves of pine that stretched so high it made your neck hurt to look up. The trail narrowed as we got higher, hugging the edges of ridgelines and cutting through fields of rock and scree. The sky stayed clear, and the sun didn't let up until late afternoon when the shadows started to lengthen and the temperature dropped again. We reached the valley around 6. It wasn't huge, maybe a mile long and a few hundred yards across. Steep, rocky walls flanked either side, rising sharply like the jaws of some sleeping animal. The ground was mostly level at the bottom, covered in a mix of soft pine needles and the occasional patch of moss or wild grass. A narrow creek snaked its way along one edge, fed by snowmelt higher up. We set up our tents near the middle, giving enough space between each for some privacy but still close enough to keep an eye on one another. I liked the spot immediately, felt isolated but safe. The rocky walls blocked the wind, and the trees offered just enough cover without feeling closed in. We boiled water, made dinner, simple freeze-dried meals, nothing fancy, and sat around talking until the sun disappeared completely and the stars came out. Out there, away from everything, the sky opens up in a way you can't explain unless you've seen it. The stars are sharp and endless. It feels like you're standing at the bottom of the world, looking up into forever. We turned in around 10. I crawled into my tent, pulled my sleeping bag around me, and settled in for what I expected to be a deep, undisturbed sleep. The cold outside crept in fast once I stopped moving, but I'd brought the right gear. I lay there for a while, listening to the water moving through the rocks and the distant hoots of an owl somewhere up the ridge. I must have drifted off around 11. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Late, sometime deep into the night, the kind of time where the world feels completely still. But it wasn't still. Something had stirred me, and it wasn't subtle. I lay there in the dark, my breath already short, body already tense. Then I heard it again, a deep, dull thud, followed by another, and then the unmistakable grinding sound of stone tearing against stone. It started far away, high up where the rocky walls met the skyline, and it rolled downward with speed. I knew exactly what it was, a rock slide. It wasn't a full-blown landslide, not the kind that wipes out everything in its path. But it wasn't small either. It wasn't a few loose pebbles tumbling lazily down a slope. These were large boulders, crashing through the trees, breaking apart everything they touched. You could hear the weight of them, the force. Each impact sent a shock wave through the valley floor, and for a terrifying moment, It sounded like they were coming straight for us. Couldn't see a thing. Not the outline of the walls, not the tops of the trees, not even the inside of my own tent. It was total black. No moon, no glow. Just the sound of destruction moving closer. My first instinct was to get out, to run. But that passed just as quickly as it came. Because where would I go? Even if I unzipped the tent and jumped out, I wouldn't be able to see the rocks coming. They would be on me before I had a chance to move. And I didn't know which direction they were coming from. The acoustics in that valley bounced sound in strange ways. Could have been 100 yards away or right above me. So I froze. I stayed in the tent, curled in my bag, not breathing, just waiting. My hands were clenched so tight around my sleeping bag that my fingers went numb. Every second felt like an hour. The noise swelled and then dipped and then swelled again. You could hear trees snapping like matchsticks. There was a kind of rhythm to it. Boulder hits ground, boulder hits tree, boulder bounces, boulder keeps falling. It was chaos, but there was some sick pattern to it. I remember trying not to make a sound, as if being quiet would protect me, as if the rocks could hear me. Eventually, the sound slowed. The crashes became fewer. The grinding faded. And then it stopped. Silence returned like it had never left. Complete. Total. Like nothing had happened. I stayed there, frozen in place, for what felt like hours. The cold sank deeper into the tent. My breath fogged the inside of the bag. I couldn't tell if the others were awake, if they'd heard what I heard. I didn't want to call out. I didn't want to break the silence. Eventually, I drifted back into a fitful, shallow sleep. When morning came, I stepped out into the pale blue light just after dawn. The air was still. The valley looked untouched. The others were already up. We didn't say much at first. No one needed to. We all had the same questions in our eyes. We checked the area, walked the edges of the clearing, followed the line of the ridge on both sides as far as we could. There was nothing. No new rock piles, no shattered trees, no scars in the dirt. It was like it never happened. We looked further out, maybe a quarter mile or so up the side of the valley. That's where the walls got steeper and more exposed. Still, nothing obvious. Maybe the rocks had fallen there, far enough away that the damage didn't reach us. The sound would have traveled easily in that place. Echoed down like a warning. I don't know. We never found out for sure. But that feeling, being pinned in place with nowhere to go, no options, no plan, that stayed with me. The pure helplessness of it. That's what I remember the most. Lying in the dark, hearing the earth rip itself apart, and knowing there wasn't a single thing I could do if it decided to take me with it. We stayed one more night. None of us slept well. Every time a branch cracked or a rock shifted under its own weight, I jolted awake. When we left the next morning, the hike out felt longer than it should have. Heavier. I kept thinking about how fast it could have ended. How a boulder the size of a fridge could have flattened me in an instant and I never would have seen it coming. I've camped a lot since then. Gone to more remote places. Pitched my tent in riskier spots. But that night in the valley left a mark. I still think about it sometimes when I lie down to sleep in the backcountry. When the trees are quiet and the stars are out and the world is still. I think about how thin the line is between being fine and being gone, and how sometimes the only thing that saves you is luck. Not skill, not planning, just blind, stupid luck. And you never really know until morning comes. I was working as a counselor at a summer camp in Southern California, tucked away deep in the woods, the kind of place where the trees stretch high above and the stars look like they're hanging just above the treetops at night. The camp was remote enough that once you were out there, you felt like you were cut off from the rest of the world. We had no real cell service, no Wi-Fi, and barely any reliable radio connection. It was just us, the kids, and the wild. And there was a lot of wild. We'd see deer wandering through the cabins sometimes. Foxes would sneak around the food shed late at night. You'd hear coyotes yipping and howling in the distance, especially just after sunset. There was even word that a mountain lion had been spotted not too far from camp, though no one had seen it up close, and most of us took that as more of a rumor than anything real. Still, the counselors were trained to keep an eye out and be cautious. The place also had this strange air about it, almost like it had a history buried just under the surface. A couple spots on the campgrounds felt old, like someone or something had been there long before us. Every camp has its collection of ghost stories, and this one was no different. You'd hear about the abandoned cabin past the stream or the fire pit that never quite stayed extinguished. None of it ever seemed like anything more than fun stories for the kids, little scares before bed. I'd never taken any of it seriously. One night, after lights out, I was standing outside my cabin. It was probably around 10:30 or 11 p.m. The kids were finally quiet, and I was talking to another counselor just outside the front steps, keeping our voices low. The air was cool but not cold, that still sort of air that only exists in the middle of nowhere at night. You could hear everything in the distance. Twigs snapping under little feet, distant owl calls, the sound of something brushing past a bush down by the lake. That's when Sadie came running up the trail. She wasn't alone either. She had her entire cabin of teenage girls with her, at least a dozen of them. All dressed in black, some of them crying or out of breath, all of them clearly rattled. Sadie herself looked panicked, eyes wide, breathing heavy, and she was normally one of the calmest people at camp. Caught me off guard immediately. They kept running past me, up toward the main lodge, but before she disappeared around the corner, Sadie yelled something over her shoulder. I didn't catch all of it, but it was enough to understand they'd heard something, thought it was a ghost, and that she'd come back to explain once her girls were settled. Sure enough, about 30 minutes later, she came back down the trail alone. The moon was high overhead, lighting up the clearing in front of our cabins just enough to see her face. She looked more composed but still clearly shaken. We sat down on the cabin steps and she explained what had happened. Apparently, she had taken her cabin out on a night hike. It was something we did now and then, a fun way to break up the usual evening routine. Her twist was that the girls were all dressed in black and pretending to be ninjas, moving quietly through the woods with flashlights off, relying only on moonlight and their own night vision. They'd been on the trail for a while when they started heading back. The path back took them through a dense patch of trees where the canopy was thick, and it was darker than the rest of the trail. That's when they heard it. Off in the woods, beyond the tree line, they heard what sounded like a child calling for help. A small, distant voice, maybe from a little girl or boy. Just a faint help. They stopped, listened, and heard it again. Only this time it sounded a little off. Still a cry for help, but distorted. The voice wasn't quite right. Sadie said it sounded like it was being stretched or echoed in a strange way. And with each repetition, the voice got weirder. Still yelling help, but not like any human voice they'd ever heard. It got more twisted, almost synthetic, like someone or something was mimicking a child's voice but getting it wrong. It stopped sounding like a kid and started sounding like something trying too hard to sound like one. At that point, they didn't wait around. They all bolted. The whole cabin group ran the rest of the trail back to camp, trying not to trip or scream. Some of the girls had cried. Couple had panic attacks. Sadie said she stayed calm for their sake, but in her mind, she was just as scared. That's why she came back out, to make sense of it. We were both adults. It was our job to look into these kinds of things. So we decided we were going to go back. Maybe it was another group messing with them. Maybe it was a camper who'd gotten lost. Maybe even some kid from town playing a prank. Either way, we needed to know. So we grabbed a flashlight, took a deep breath, and started back down the trail. The trail was quiet. No wind, no animal sounds. Just the crunch of our boots on the dirt and the occasional brush of branches against our legs. We didn't talk. Didn't need to. We were both focused. When we got to the dark patch of trees where Sadie had heard the voice, we stopped and waited. The air felt thick there. I know how that sounds, but there's really no other way to put it. Like the air itself had weight to it. We stood still for a while, listening, and then we heard it. Not from a specific place, not from a single point in the woods, but from the whole mountainside. It wasn't the voice of a child anymore. It was a screech, like a scream warped through 1,000 layers of something unnatural. It echoed in a way that didn't make sense, like it bounced around and came from every direction at once. High-pitched, drawn out, full of static and reverb, like someone had recorded a child yelling for help and dragged it out on bad speakers. And it came again, louder. It hit something deep in the brain. That primal fear that tells you to run before you understand what you're running from. We didn't talk, didn't agree on anything. We just turned and ran. I wasn't even aware of how fast I was going until we hit the edge of the open area near the cabins. Only when we saw the lights again did I realize I'd been running harder than I had in years. My lungs hurt, and I could taste blood in the back of my throat. We told everyone who would listen. A few believed us, but most just laughed it off. Some of the younger counselors looked uneasy, but the older ones said it was probably just an animal. The next morning, the camp director called a meeting. They explained that the area had bobcats, that they were harmless, but made high-pitched, yelping, almost human-like sounds at night. They told us to tell our campers not to worry if they heard something strange in the woods. And that was it, the official answer, the logical explanation. But to this day, neither Sadie nor I buy it completely. Maybe it was a bobcat. Maybe the acoustics of the valley just made it sound worse than it was. But there was something about that sound, something that felt intentional, intelligent, and just wrong. Still, we let it go. What else could we do? The summer went on. Campfires, esmores, hikes, talent shows, swimming lessons. But the story followed us. Anytime someone joked about ghosts or scary things in the woods, someone brought it up. And every time they did, someone would imitate the scream or whisper help in a fake voice, trying to get a rise out of us. And I laughed. I played along. But every night before I turned in, I found myself listening. Just for a second. Just in case I heard it again. I never did. But that one night stuck with me. Not because I thought it was something supernatural. Not because I believed in ghosts. But because in that moment, in those woods, there was something out there. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Something that turned my instincts all the way up to 10 and made me feel like prey. That was the worst part. Not the scream itself, but the way it made me feel. Completely exposed. Vulnerable. Like I didn't belong out there. Like whatever made that noise didn't want us there. Or worse, that it did. And I never went back to that part of the trail again.